Ancient India. The Indian subcontinent is a large triangle-shaped piece of land in the south of Asia. It is separated from the rest of the continent by the Himalayan mountains. In the northeast is the Ganges River, and to the northwest is the Indus River. The southern half of the Indian subcontinent is taken up by an area called the Deccan Plateau. This map shows the topography of India. India's weather is dictated by the monsoon, a seasonal wind pattern that brings warm, moist air from the southwest during the summer months, and cool, dry air from the northeast during the winter months. The monsoon can bring heavy torrential rainfall for several months, often leading to flooding. India was first settled along the Indus River between 3000 BC and 1500 BC. Two cities, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, were the oldest cities in India. They're about 400 miles apart, but have an almost identical layout. Harappa, at its height, had about 35,000 inhabitants, while Mohenjo-daro had close to 40,000. The buildings in both cities were made of oven-baked mud bricks. Even though the two cities were nearly 400 miles apart, they are laid out almost identically, indicating that the two cities were linked in some way. Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were theocracies, ruled by priests and divine authority, like ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt. The people of these two cities were primarily farmers, but they also built an extensive trade network. Around 1500 BC, a nomadic Indo-European group called the Aryans entered India. By around 1000 BC, they controlled most of the Indian subcontinent. They used iron tools and weapons, which allowed them to gain access to the Ganges River, which is surrounded by dense forests. The Aryans would develop a writing system around 1000 BC called Sanskrit. The Aryans were a light-skinned Indo-European group that came from Southwest Asia, sometime between 2000 BC and 1500 BC. They managed to conquer most of India, though they were not a unified empire like many of the Mesopotamian civilizations we looked at previously. India, under the Aryans, was not a unified country, but a loose collection of independent city-states and small kingdoms. Each one was ruled by a Raja, an Aryan prince. Indian society under the Aryans was very rigid. They used something called the caste system, a rigid social structure in ancient India based partly on skin color. Aryans were more light-skinned and at the top of the system, while darker-skinned natives were lower. The 5 major groups in Indian society were called castes. The caste system was very rigid. Members of one caste were not allowed to marry or even interact with members of a higher caste. Though it no longer exists today, the caste system still has an impact on the way some people in India treat each other. At the top of the caste system were the Brahmins, the priest caste. They were Aryans. Next came the Kshatriyas, the warrior caste. They were also Aryans. Third were the Vaisyas. These were commoners, mostly merchants and farmers, and also Aryans. Below them were the Sudras, the peasants, who were dark-skinned natives. And finally, there were the Untouchables, who were technically outside the caste system. Untouchables had all the grossest and most disgusting jobs. Hinduism is the religion based on the belief system of the Aryans. It was developed sometime around 1500 BC. Like many of the other religions in the ancient world, it was polytheistic. It had a holy book called the Bhagavad Gita and 3 main gods. The first god was Brahma, the creator god, who dreams the world into existence. Second, there was Vishnu, the preserver god, who maintains existence. Brahma is the Hindu creator god who dreams the world into existence. while Vishnu is the Hindu preserver god who maintains the status quo. Completing this trinity of gods, we have Shiva, the destroyer god, who unmakes the world from moment to moment so that Brahman can recreate it. All Hindus have Atman, the duty of the individual to seek an understanding of ultimate reality, called Brahman. Hindus believe in reincarnation, the idea that a soul is reborn into a new body after death. Shiva is the Hindu destroyer god who unmakes the universe in each moment so that it can be remade by Brahma. Hindus see life as a cycle. Death is not an ending, but a new beginning, a new life through reincarnation. Therefore, a goddess like Shiva, the destroyer, is not evil, but a vital and important part of the circle of life, death, and rebirth. Without an ending of the old life, a new one cannot begin. Hindus believe in karma, a force that is generated by a person's actions that determines how that person will be reborn in the next life. Karma is determined through dharma, the divine law that requires people to do their duty. Duty varies depending on the station or caste of the individual. Hindus practice yoga, a word that means union. It is a method of training designed to achieve a connection with Brahman. So karma is not simply doing good so good things will happen to you. Instead, it is following the rules of society, fulfilling your assigned role as well as you possibly can. If you do that, it was believed that you would move up a step in your next incarnation. Another belief system developed in India in the 600s BC was Buddhism. Buddhism was started by a man named Siddhartha Gautama, who lived a life of luxury until he discovered someone's suffering, and then set out to understand suffering himself. First, he became an ascetic, a person who practices self-denial to achieve an understanding of ultimate reality, but eventually decided this was not the path for him. The story goes that Siddhartha, a young man from a wealthy family, never lacked for anything he desired and never suffered. His life was free from suffering and pain until one day when he went outside of his home and witnessed a poor person sick and dying. This caused Siddhartha to realize that he too would one day die and set him off on a path to discover how to end suffering. His search for enlightenment, eventually finding it meditating under the Bodhi tree, is the root of Buddhism. Buddhists are seeking nirvana, or ultimate reality. The goal of Buddhism is to achieve an understanding of the universe and one's place in it, for one's soul to become enlightened and part of what Buddha called the great world soul. To achieve enlightenment, one must recognize the Four Noble Truths. First, life is suffering. To exist is to suffer. Second, suffering is caused by desire, wanting what we cannot have. The way to end suffering is to end desire. And the way to end desire, the Buddha believed, is to follow something called the middle path. The middle path is also known as the Eightfold Path, for there are 8 parts to it. You have right view, which is to know the Four Noble Truths. Right intention, which is to decide what it is that we really want. Right speech, which is to speak the truth. Right action, which means do not kill, steal, lie, be unchaste, or take drugs and alcohol. Right livelihood, do things that make us better as people. Right effort, persevere against adversity, continue even when it's hard. Right mindfulness, our minds are in control of our bodies, not the other way around. And finally, right concentration, meditate to see the world in a new way. Siddhartha believed in reincarnation, but not in the rigid caste system of Hinduism. He thought that anyone, regardless of their caste, could achieve nirvana. Buddhism Buddhism is unique in that it doesn't have any gods, and Siddhartha himself refused to allow people to worship him. Buddhism also lacks a holy book. In these ways, Buddhism is less a religion and more philosophy or a way of life. The Aryan kingdoms were conquered in 400 BC by the Persians, and then conquered again in 327 BC when Alexander the Great, a Macedonian king, invaded northwestern India. Following Alexander's invasion, India was in a state of disarray. A man named Chandragupta Maurya established a new Indian state in 324 BC and ruled until 301 BC. He built a new capital at a city called Pataliputra. Unlike the Aryans, Chandragupta Maurya created a unified empire across most of India. Chandragupta's grandson, a man named Asoka, is widely considered the greatest ruler in Indian history. Asoka used Buddhist principles to guide his rule. He built shelters along major roads and developed a massive commercial network that spread from the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Unfortunately, the Mauryan Empire collapsed 50 years after his death. Asoka was a wise, benevolent ruler who improved the lives of everyone in his empire. He is widely regarded as the greatest ruler of ancient India. The Kushan kingdom was a kingdom.
Howdy. This is how you doing that, so I was like, oh.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, I've paused it, so. The kingdom of the Guptas was started by a man named Chandragupta in AD 320. Chandragupta was not related in any way to Chandragupta Maurya, though the new kingdom of the Guptas did build their new capital at the city of Pataliputra just as the old Mauryan had. Chandragupta's son, Samudragupta, expanded his kingdom to control all of northern India. Pilgrims are people traveling somewhere for a religious purpose. Many pilgrims used the Silk Road and a lot of the other massive trade networks established by the kingdom of the Guptas. The kingdom of the Guptas was eventually overrun by the Huns in the late 400s AD. The Vedas were a book primarily about the religion of the Aryans, originally passed down orally, but eventually written down using Sanskrit, the written language of India. Other important ancient Indian literature included the Mahabharata, a 90,000 stanza epic poem written around 100 BC that describes a war between two cousins for the control of a kingdom. The most famous section of the Mahabharata is the Bhagavad Gita, a sermon by the avatar Krishna, the human representative of the god Vishnu, before a major battle. Krishna was an avatar, or a human representation, of the Hindu god Vishnu. His blue skin was an indication of his connection to divinity and the gods. The Ramayana was a shorter piece, written around the same time as the Mahabharata, about the reign of a fictional king, Rama. The Ramayana was used to teach moral and religious lessons. There were three major contributions to ancient Indian architecture. The first were pillars, massive stone pillars built along roadsides, marking places where important events in the life of the Buddha took place. They usually had carvings of lions or something similar on top that were speaking the words of the Buddha. Stupas were originally designed to house a relic or an object related to the Buddha. They were built like burial mounds, but became sites of general Buddhist worship over time. And finally, there were rock chambers, small rooms or even large ones carved out of the sides of cliffs for monks to live and pray in. They could become quite elaborate over the years, as seen in the picture to the left. Ancient Indians were particularly good at astronomy, having charted the movements of stars and figured out that the Earth was round, spun on an axis, and revolved around the sun. A Guptan mathematician by the name of Aryabhata helped develop algebra. Other Indian mathematicians created the concept and the symbol for the number 0.